My white neighbor called police on my grandkids, so I bought her house and evicted her. 74-year-old Dorothy Williams had been living peacefully in her suburban Cleveland neighborhood for 35 years until Barbara Henderson moved in next door and decided that a black family didn't belong in her perfect white community. It started small, the way racism usually does. Barbara would watch Dorothy from her window whenever Dorothy worked in her garden. She would call the homeowners association to complain about Dorothy's lawn ornaments, her garden decorations, even the color she painted her front door. But when Dorothy's grandchildren started visiting regularly, Barbara Henderson revealed her true nature. Dorothy had 4 grandchildren who ranged in age from 8 to 16. They were good kids, honor roll students involved in sports and music. But to Barbara Henderson, they were just black children who didn't belong in her neighborhood. The first incident happened on a Saturday afternoon in June. Dorothea's grandson Marcus, age 12, was riding his bicycle in front of Dorothea's house when Barbara called the police to report a suspicious persons. Dorothy watched from her kitchen window as a police car pulled up and an officer approached Marcus, who was clearly a child riding a bicycle in broad daylight in front of his grandmother's house. The officer was professional and quickly realized that there was no crime being committed. But Dorothy was furious that her grandson had been subjected to police questioning for the crime of being black in his own neighborhood. When Dorothy confronted Barbara about the incident, Barbara claimed she was just being cautious about security. But Dorothy could see the smug satisfaction in Barbara's eyes. The second incident was worse. Dorothea's granddaughter, Keisha, age 14, was playing basketball in Dorothea's driveway with her brother when Barbara called police again, this time claiming that the children were being too loud and disturbing the peace. Again, police responded, and again they found no violation of any laws. But Keisha was shaken by having officers question her about playing basketball at her grandmother's house in the middle of the afternoon. Dorothy realized that Barbara was using the police as a weapon to harass her family and make them feel unwelcome in their own neighborhood. The third incident crossed every line. When Dorothy's youngest grandson, Jamal, age 8, was playing alone in Dorothy's fenced backyard, Barbara called police to report a possible break-in, claiming she had seen a suspicious child in the yard. This time when police arrived, they found Jamal crying and confused about why strange men in uniforms were asking him questions about playing in his grandmother's yard, where he had been playing safely for years. Dorothy was done being patient, done making excuses for Barbara's behavior, and done trying to coexist peacefully with a woman who was clearly trying to terrorize her family. That evening, Dorothy called her lawyer, Patricia Moss, who had been handling Dorothy's legal affairs for 15 years. Patricia was also a black woman who had experienced racism in her own professional life, and she understood exactly what Dorothy was dealing with. Patricia told Dorothy that what Barbara was doing was not just morally wrong, but potentially illegal as a pattern of racially motivated harassment that could constitute a civil rights violation. But Patricia also had a different suggestion. Instead of just pursuing legal action against Barbara, why didn't Dorothy consider a more permanent solution to the problem? Patricia explained that the house Barbara was living in was actually a rental property owned by an elderly white man named Robert Chen, who lived in Florida and had inherited the property from his parents. Robert Chen had been renting the house to Barbara for 3 years, but Patricia had reason to believe that he might be interested in selling the property if the right offer came along. Dorothy was intrigued by the possibility, but wondered how she could afford to buy the house next door. Patricia smiled and reminded Dorothy that she was sitting on significant assets that she could leverage. Dorothy owned her house outright, worth approximately $400,000. She also had retirement savings of over $300,000 from her 40-year career as a social worker. More importantly, Dorothy had recently inherited a substantial sum from her late sister, including a portfolio of stocks and bonds worth nearly $200,000. Patricia suggested that Dorothy could easily afford to purchase the rental property next door, either with cash or with a mortgage that would be easily manageable given her financial position. But the real genius of Patricia's plan was what Dorothy could do after purchasing the property. As the new owner, Dorothy would have the legal right to terminate Barbara's lease and evict her from the neighborhood permanently. Dorothy loved the idea of turning the tables on Barbara, using legal and financial power to solve a problem that Barbara had created through illegal racial harassment. Patricia agreed to research the property ownership and contact Robert Chen about a potential sale, while Dorothy began planning her strategy. It took Patricia only 2 phone calls to discover that Robert Chen was indeed interested in selling the rental property. He was 86 years old, living in a retirement community in Florida, and tired of dealing with rental management from a distance. Robert Shin had inherited the Cleveland property from his parents, who had bought it in 1962, and he had been renting it out for supplemental income. But the responsibilities of long-distance property ownership were becoming burdensome. When Patricia contacted Robert Chen and explained that her client was interested in purchasing the property for cash, he was immediately interested in discussing terms. Robert Chen had the property appraised at $320,000, which was within Dorothea's budget, especially since she could pay cash and close quickly. Patricia negotiated a purchase price of $300,000 with a 30-day closing period. Dorothy would pay cash, and Robert Chen would handle the termination of Barbara's lease as part of the sale process. But Dorothy wanted to keep her purchase plan secret until after the closing. She didn't want Barbara to know what was happening until it was too late for her to interfere. During the 30 days leading up to the closing, Barbara continued her harassment campaign, calling police on Dorothea's grandchildren 2 more times, once when they were playing catch in the front yard, and once when they were washing Dorothea's car in the driveway. Each time police responded, and each time they found no wrongdoing, but the pattern of harassment was now clearly documented. Dorothy used this time to research her rights as a landlord and to plan her approach to Barbara's eviction. She wanted everything to be legal, proper, and unquestionable. Patricia helped Dorothy understand that, as the new property owner, she would have the right to terminate Barbara's month-to-month lease with 30 days written notice. She would not need to provide a reason for the termination as long as it was not discriminatory. Of course, Dorothea's reason for wanting Barbara out was Barbara's discriminatory behavior toward Dorothea's family. But legally, Dorothy would simply be exercising her right as a property owner to choose her tenants. The closing took place on a Tuesday morning. At Patricia Moss' law office, Dorothy paid $300,000 in cash and became the owner of the house next door. That afternoon, Dorothy had a locksmith change all the locks on the property and had a property management company inspect the house for any needed repairs or maintenance. Barbara had no idea that anything had changed. She continued living in the house, unaware that her landlord was now the black neighbor she had been trying to drive out of the neighborhood. Dorothy waited exactly 1 week after the closing before making her move. She wanted to savor the anticipation, and she wanted to make sure all the paperwork was properly filed and recorded.
On the following Tuesday,
exactly 1 week after she had purchased the house, Dorothy walked over to Barbara's front door and knocked. Barbara opened the door with her usual expression of irritation, clearly annoyed to see Dorothy on her doorstep. "Yes, what do you want?" Barbara said rudely. Dorothy smiled sweetly and said, "Hello, Barbara. I wanted to introduce myself. I'm your new landlord." Barbara's face went blank with confusion. "What are you talking about?" Dorothy explained that she had purchased the house from Robert Chen and was now Barbara's landlord. She handed Barbara an official notice to quit, informing her that her lease was being terminated with 30 days notice. Barbara stared at the document in disbelief. "This can't be legal," she stammered. "You can't do this." Dorothy continued smiling. "Oh, but I can. Barbara, as the property owner, I have the right to choose my tenants, and I've decided that you're no longer welcome here." Barbara's face turned red with anger. "This is discrimination. You can evict me because I'm white." Dorothy laughed softly. "Barbara, after months of you calling police on my grandchildren for playing in their own yard, you're really going to accuse me of discrimination? The law says I can terminate your month-to-month lease with 30 days notice, and that's exactly what I'm doing." Dorothy continued, "You have 30 days to find a new place to live." Barbara tried to argue that she had rights as a tenant, but Dorothy had done her research. The lease termination was completely legal, and Barbara had no grounds to challenge it. Over the next 30 days, Barbara made several desperate attempts to stay in the house. She offered to pay higher rent. She promised to stop calling police on Dorothy's grandchildren. She even tried to claim that she had nowhere else to go. But Dorothy was unmoved. Barbara had shown her true character through months of racial harassment, and Dorothy was not interested in giving her another chance. Barbara also tried to find legal representation to challenge the eviction, but every lawyer she consulted told her the same thing. The eviction was legal, and she had no grounds to fight it. As the 30-day deadline approached, Barbara became increasingly desperate. She started leaving notes in Dorothea's mailbox, begging for more time. She called Patricia Moss' office, trying to negotiate an extension. She even approached Dorothy at the grocery store, pleading for mercy. But Dorothy had made her decision. Barbara Henderson had used fear, intimidation, and racial bias to try to drive Dorothea's family out of the neighborhood. Now Barbara would experience what it felt like to be forced from her home on the final day of the 30-day notice period. Barbara had still not moved out, so Dorothy initiated formal eviction proceedings through the court system. The sheriff department served Barbara with eviction papers and scheduled a date for her physical removal from the property. If she did not leave voluntarily, 2 days before the scheduled eviction, Barbara finally accepted reality and moved out of the house. She loaded her belongings into a rental truck and left the neighborhood without saying goodbye to anyone. Dorothy watched from her kitchen window as Barbara drove away for the last time, ending months of racial harassment and intimidation. But Dorothy wasn't finished with her plans for the house next door. She had purchased it not just to evict Barbara, but to make a positive difference in her community. Dorothy decided to use the house as affordable housing for a deserving family, specifically a family that might face housing discrimination elsewhere. Through her connections as a retired social worker, Dorothy knew many families who struggled to find quality housing in safe neighborhoods due to racial bias, economic challenges, or other barriers. Dorothy chose to rent the house to Maria Gonzalez, a single mother of 3 who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. Maria had been looking for a house in a good school district, but had faced repeated rejection from landlords who discriminated against single mothers. Dorothy offered Maria the house at below market rent, with the understanding that Maria would maintain the property and be a good neighbor to the community. Maria and her children moved in 2 weeks after Barbara moved out, bringing life, laughter, and positive energy to a house that had been occupied by hatred and fear. Dorothy's grandchildren were thrilled to have new neighbors close to their own ages, and the Gonzalez children quickly became part of the extended neighborhood family. 6 months later, Dorothy received a letter from Barbara, who had moved to a suburb 30 miles away. Barbara wrote that she had realized her behavior toward Dorothy's family had been wrong and that she wanted to apologize. But Barbara also wrote that she felt Dorothy had been vindictive in buying the house just to evict her, and that 2 wrongs didn't make a right. Dorothy read the letter twice, then threw it away. She had no interest in Barbaras, apologies, or her opinions about vindictiveness. Dorothy had not bought the house to be vindictive. She had bought it to protect her family from continued harassment and to demonstrate that actions have consequences. More importantly, Dorothy had used her financial power to create positive change in her community by providing affordable housing to a deserving family. The story of Dorothy buying her neighbor's house to evict a racist tenant spread throughout the Cleveland area and eventually gained national attention. Dorothy was interviewed by local news stations and invited to speak at community events about fighting racism and using economic power for social justice. She always told the same story. Barbara Henderson tried to use police as a weapon against black children playing in their own yard. So Dorothy used property ownership as a weapon against racial harassment. Dorothy S.'s story became an inspiration for other people of color who felt powerless against racist neighbors and discriminatory treatment. She proved that sometimes the best response to racial harassment is not just to endure it or report it, but to use whatever power you have to change the situation permanently. Maria Gonzalez and her children thrived in their new home. The children excelled in the local schools. Maria was promoted to head nurse at the hospital, and the family became beloved members of the community. Dorothy's grandchildren continued to visit regularly, playing basketball in the driveway, riding bicycles on the sidewalk, and enjoying their childhood without fear of police harassment. The house that had once been occupied by hatred became a symbol of how communities can heal when racist behavior is confronted with decisive action. Dorothy S.'s story also became a lesson in how wealth and property ownership can be tools for social justice when used thoughtfully and strategically. She had turned Barbara's weapon of choice, police intimidation against her, by using legal financial power to remove Barbara from the community permanently. But perhaps most importantly, Dorothy had demonstrated that being the target of racism does not mean being powerless against it. 3 years later, Dorothy still owned both houses and had paid off the mortgage on the rental property using income from her retirement investment. Maria Gonzalez had saved enough money to consider buying the house from Dorothy, but Dorothy decided to sell it to Maria at below market value, ensuring that the Gonzalez family would have permanent housing security. At the closing ceremony, Dorothy gave a speech about how the house had transformed from a source of racial tension to a symbol of community healing and economic empowerment. She ended her speech by saying, "Barbara Henderson thought she could use fear to drive my family out of this neighborhood. Instead, she drove herself out and made room for a family that truly belongs here." Dorothy Williams proved that quiet dignity combined with strategic action can overcome racial harassment, that economic power can be a tool for justice, and that sometimes the best way to deal with racist neighbors is to become their landlord. Her story lived on as an example of how individuals can fight systemic racism through personal action, and how property ownership can be used to create positive change in communities. The house next door stood as a testament to the truth that hatred is temporary, but justice, when properly applied, can be permanent. Dorothy had shown that being elderly and black in America does not mean being powerless against racism. It means being wise enough to know when to fight and strategic enough to win.